Well, I think what our new framework is going to do is it's going to make it more likely that people at the margins of society can participate in our labor market. We're not going to preemptively start raising interest rates when we see unemployment getting extremely low, unless we see signs of inflation. And I think what that will do is mean that the economy will have some extended stimulus, and that will allow more people to get jobs for a much longer period of time. By the Federal Reserve Act, the Federal Reserve has two mandates. One is stable prices, to make sure that the price level does not fluctuate too wildly. And the other is maximum employment, to try to make sure that the economy is operating as robustly and as large as possible. We work to try to manage that through an interest rate policy, as well as other tools that we have at our disposal. The Phillips curve is a relationship between employment and the level of prices. So what the Phillips curve says is that as we get employment and labor markets that are tighter and tighter, inflation will get more and more intense. And so as you get closer and closer to full employment levels, you should see, according to the curve, spikes in inflation that could move the economy into a much less stable position when it comes to the price level. So what the Phillips curve tells us about employment is that as levels of employment go up, as you get to labor markets that are tighter and tighter, that's going to put pressure on wages. Firms are going to have to compete more to get workers, and that will translate into higher prices for final goods. High inflation in the 1970s was really detrimental to the economy.
The tyranny of double-digit inflation is our common enemy in 1974.
Do I feel angry? Sure.
The experience in the 70s certainly was a marker, and it allowed the Fed to really reflect and come to a conclusion that they didn't want to have that ever happen again. And so there is a propensity, and has been a propensity, to proactively prevent inflation from spiking to very high levels. When people say the Phillips curve is flattened, what they mean is that we're not seeing the same type of response in the price level to very high levels of employment that we used to. So that sensitivity to tight labor markets is not triggering inflation in the marketplace. And to that extent, what it means is that if you drew that curve out, it would show a much flatter relationship. What we see in terms of our general employment levels and many of the national statistics are really averages of a number of different relationships. And so we actually try to dive more deeply into that and see how different segments of the economy are performing and how workers from different experiences and backgrounds are experiencing the economy. The data has been pretty clear on this for quite some time, that the employment for minorities has lagged that for the general population. And if you look at unemployment rates, I think the basic rule has been that unemployment rates for African Americans has been about twice that for the general population. Well, the natural rate of unemployment is basically the level of employment that you would see if everyone who wanted a job could have one, and it was not going to trigger inflation. My estimate of the natural rate of employment has really changed over my entire career. When I started in my role here, the estimate was more in the 4.5% range. I've really perceived that the natural rate has fallen even further, somewhere south of 4%, maybe in the 3.7 to 3.8% level. And that's really informed how I've thought about what appropriate policy should look like. Well, I think we've learned a lot over the last 7 or 8 years since the great financial crisis. And all of the signals that we've learned have suggested that we can be a bit more patient in increasing rates and responding to very tight labor markets. So I think moving forward, what we will expect, and what I expect we'll see from the committee, is a willingness to keep rates lower for longer and really wait for signs of inflation before moving to a more proactive policy approach. The higher inflation is a challenge for people that have constrained incomes and constrained wealth. And this is one of the reasons why, as we think about what appropriate policy is, we keep those people in mind and make sure that we are doing all we can to understand the challenges that they face. But one thing I would say is that if we're going to have an economy that works for all people, monetary policy is just going to be one tool for that. We're going to need investments on the fiscal side, as well as in state and local governments, to make sure that there's an infrastructure so that people can get the skills that allow them to have higher wages so they can manage and prosper in an economy that's growing robustly.